Good morning, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar. Today, our topic is science-based target setting strategy for 2026, as well as the road ahead. I'm Helena, managing partner at Agendi, joining from London. I've spent the last 2 decades working with global organizations on climate strategy, target setting, and decarbonisation planning. Today, I am joined by Natalia, associate partner at Agendi, based in San Francisco, who you'll hear from later on. And both Natalia and myself are SBTi certified experts. We're listed on the public register of recognized professionals who support organizations across initial target setting, as well as the broader target management life cycle. We're also really excited to have Kyra here from the Science Based Target Initiative itself. Kyra will introduce herself in a moment. There's a lot of changes at present. The finalized updates of the net zero standard is expected soon. So really fabulous to have Kyra with us to present a detailed overview of these changes and what to expect. So over the next 45 minutes, what we want to leave you with is a clear understanding of the key milestones your organization may encounter across your SBTi lifecycle. We also want to leave you with a view of what's evolving in the process, the validation pathway, and importantly, how to prepare for the upcoming V2 standard. Quick note before we begin, you'll see we've popped a poll in the chat. We'd really love to hear from you where you sit in terms of your maturity and which areas matter most to your organization. We'll be recording this session. As always, we'll share the slides and the recording with leaving time for Q&A at the end, but we're also more than happy to follow up with any specific queries after the event. I'll begin with a quick introduction to Agendi for those who are less familiar. We are a specialist climate and sustainability consulting firm. We work across organizations of all sizes and sectors with a focus on large global organizations. And our approach is very much grounded in practical delivery, building robust long-term strategies. And we support organizations from end-to-end knowledge capacity building through to emissions quantification and impact assessment into strategic planning, including materiality, target setting, topic for today, and transition pathways, and importantly, implementation and innovation. So that's delivering on your targets and commitments. And finally, reporting and disclosure, we support across the entire landscape of voluntary and compliance schemes. And I'll hand here briefly to Kyra to introduce the SBTi's work and goals, and then we'll come back with the contents and forward-looking piece of the webinar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. And thank you to Helena and Natalia and the Agendi team for having me. As said, my name is Kyra Power. So I am the engagement manager covering the North America region at SBTi. However, some of my work also extends globally. So for those of you, I imagine you're familiar with the SBTi if you are on this webinar, but in the event that somehow you have missed us in the corporate climate ecosystem, we are a corporate climate action organization. We enable companies and financial institutions to play their part in combating the climate crisis. Our really reason for existence is to translate climate science into actionable targets. So establishing standards, guidance, normative documents, et cetera, to help companies on their decarbonization journey. Recently, we have evolved into an independent standard setter with a subsidiary, SBTi Services, which validates targets against the standards the SBTi sets. I sit on the SBTi side, the charity and standard setter. And now let's take a brief look at some of our impact since we were founded in 2015. So we're really proud, and honestly, I think we've all been somewhat shocked at the SBTi of how much we have grown in the last decade. So you can see here that over 13,000 businesses have committed or validated targets with the SBTi. We're extremely proud of this number, and all indicators show that we are continuing to grow into 2026. We just recently released a trend tracker on our website that you can look at if you're interested to see kind of the lay of the land in terms of target setting. But one key takeaway here is that momentum has not stalled. We are continuing to see companies set science-based targets, and we're really excited for what's ahead.
Lovely, thanks, Kyra. Moving on to the contents of what we have over our session today, it's broken into five key areas. And first, we'll touch on some of the key SBTi milestones across the target life cycle. And so what triggers subsequent action for organizations. Next, we'll go into updated processes, so what the validation process looks like, an overview of recent changes. And then third, and it'll largely be our focus area, we're going to hand to Kyra from SBTi, who will cover the proposed net zero version 2 updates and what to expect. Finally, key takeaways, next steps, Q&As. Please do submit your questions throughout. We'll possibly be able to answer some of them live. More than happy to leave some time. And if there's any left over, we'll of course follow up directly after the webinar. And that also goes for any slightly more complex or queries that may require a deeper follow-up. Great, so let's begin on the key milestones. So within an SBTi life cycle, there's 4 key milestones that an organization may encounter. They're spread across the slide here. We, of course, have first-time target submission, potential base year recalculation, the 5-year review period, and subsequent targets. So once you've achieved a target, what are the next phase of targets going forward? And for each of these milestones, it comes with different requirements, risks, opportunities. So over the next few slides, I will be stepping through each of these key areas and looking at the key considerations. So starting first with the first-time target submission, and this is where companies formally enter the SBTi process. At a high level, the requirements are relatively straightforward. You register on the SBTi services portal, develop your targets, and then submit for validation. And key considerations to keep in mind are timing of validation. From the point of formal commitment, companies have a 24-month window to submit targets for validation. And those with a keen eye will have seen that the SBTi public dashboard has been updated recently to include a broader set of status descriptors. So any company that fails to set a validated target within the 24-month commitment window will then be noted as commitment removed. The key part of setting an initial target is developing the targets themselves, as well as a decarbonisation strategy to achieve that target. And then, of course, ensuring your targets align with the latest criteria and target setting tools. We want to make sure that the underlying data is robust and also that the accounting methodologies of emissions can demonstrate decarbonisation. So that would mean you're not solely relying on spend-based proxy or estimates. And Natalia is going to go into that more depth later in the webinar. And moving on to the second milestone, that's the base year and target recalculation. This is typically triggered where there's been a material change in the emissions. So generally, we see that as around the 5% threshold. And drivers of this may be mergers, acquisitions, divestments, or changes in organizational boundary. We also have major structural changes, etc. It can also be triggered through improvements to data quality or underlying methodologies. And so that might be moving from full proxy or spend-based estimates to more granular activity-based data. And now when the above takes place, SBTi sets the expectation that companies follow a structured reassessment process. And so this would involve first rebaselining. So that's updating your emissions to reflect the new organization or emissions accounting reality. And the same principles apply within the initial target setting, and that it remains representative and consistent. And then we move on to target recalibration. So you need to assess whether your existing targets still align with the SBTi criteria and your updated emissions profile. Next, we have the target recalculation. So where required, you may need to adjust the level of ambition or the pathway to reflect the revised baseline. And then finally, there's potential revalidation of the target. So if the changes are significant enough to warrant a change to the target, then a revalidation process is required. And most commonly, we see this occurring when, say, the 67% coverage of scope 3 is no longer met. And I'll stress here that rebaselining itself does not automatically trigger a target revalidation submission. If you find that your targets still meet the criteria after rebaselining, then no formal submission is required. And I'll move on now to some of the key considerations of base year and target recalculation. So your base year emissions will need to be updated to reflect any changes, major structural changes, etc., as I outlined. If your company structure changes, you should calculate the whole year. So even if the structure changes come in only partway through, you should, of course, account for the entire year and then exclude emissions that did not exist within the base year. Targets should be calculated as soon as possible. Companies should make this integration within a year of completion of the full reporting cycle after the structural change. There are also other situations in which the target recalculation may be triggered. So this might mean if scope 3 emissions become more than 40% of total emissions, or if your organization exceeds the threshold size that previously qualified for SME status. The next milestone is the SBTi mandatory 5-year review, which is essentially a strategic checkpoint. And this applies to all companies with validated targets as of March 2021, and essentially requires a 5-year review from the date the target was set or last fully updated. And so the first step within this process is reviewing your target. Upon the trigger date of the review, companies will need to review their active validated targets to check whether or not they conform with the SBTi criteria and the standards in effect at the time of the review. So that would be the latest criteria. Within 6 months of the trigger date, companies are expected to submit evidence to SBTi services via the form in the validation portal and disclosing the results of the review. Of course, we then have SBTi assessing the results and providing an outcome within 30 business days. And lastly, if necessary, companies that find their targets no longer conform with the latest criteria, they're required to submit a target update within 12 months of that initial trigger date. And I'll move on here to an example of a 5-year review timeline. And this is a really common query that we receive from our clients. So the company here first validated their targets in 2021 in March. In August 2023, the company updated the level of ambition for their scope 1. So only their scope 1 target changed. And so this doesn't change the trigger date. It will remain the same because the full suite of targets were not updated. Their trigger date then remains at the end of the month of March, 5 years after their first target validation. They then have until September, so that's 6 months, to submit evidence of their review. And at the end of March 2027, 12 months after the trigger date, they actually need to submit any updated targets if that part is needed. And so moving on to some of the key considerations for 5-year review processes. Key element here is making sure that you have enough time. You have 6 months from your trigger date, which should be enough time to perform the review. However, don't wait until the last moment. If you don't complete the review in time, as I referenced earlier, we have the updated status descriptors on the portal. Your target status may change from active to expired if you go past that review period. There are certain ways to extend the timeline. So one of those is if you're anticipating a sector-specific standard update, you can request formally for an extension. And organizations also have the option to skip the 5-year review if your nearest target year is within 24 months of the trigger date. So you would be essentially setting new targets anyway. I'll move on now to the last milestone, which is the subsequent targets, a forward-looking next phase level of ambition. And this applies if you've already reached or surpassed your target year, or potentially you're interested in updating your target type or methodology. You would need to follow the process of submitting to SBTi, quite similar to the first time targets. We won't go into the requirements here, but do keep in mind that the corporate net zero standard proposes quite significant updates, which may result in potentially substantially different targets to what you initially set. Although Kyra from SBTi will be covering those proposed changes later on in the webinar. Also keep in mind that if one or more year passes after you've achieved your current targets without any new targets submitted to SBTi, then the status on the target public dashboard will also move to expired status. A bit of a speed run through those milestones, but more than happy to answer any questions that have had a look joined in the Q&A box or answer offline. And I'll hand over here to Natalia, who will cover the updated SBTi processes.
Great. Thank you. So as Helena mentioned, we didn't go into a lot of detail on the requirements for that first and last milestone, the first time targets and subsequent targets, because I'm about to do so now. For those of you who have gone through this process before, this will look familiar, but I'm going to highlight some of the changes. For those who have not, just as a general FYI, SBTi has developed two different routes to set science-based targets. The standard route, which is what we're going to be walking through, and then separately a SME route, which is for small and medium-sized enterprises, which we won't be discussing very much today, but does look like a simplified version of what we're going to cover. So there are 6 steps. The first is registration. So this is one of those new steps. If you have set targets prior to last year, so in 2024 and earlier, this might not have been a step that you've done before. Now SBTi uses a centralized services validation portal, replacing the previous email and Google Forms and Jotform submissions. So the first step that your company is going to have to do is register through the portal. Everything else from here on out happens in the portal until you get approved targets, including commitments. Another change, if you've done this process before, is that commitments are now optional. You can still commit to setting a science-based target directly within the portal, and it still maintains that 24-month expiry for any commitments that are voluntarily submitted, but they're no longer a required portion of the process. If you do choose to submit a commitment, SBTi typically reviews them within the portal and accepts the commitments within 10 working days. And then once accepted, your company will then appear in the target dashboard. Step 3 is developing the targets. I'm going to go through steps 3 through 6 in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides, but at a high level, this is probably where you're going to spend most of your time. The target development process is likely the longest and most tedious portion of the science-based targets process, and is where you're using the latest criteria, latest guidance, including sector-specific guidance if applicable, to develop the target options and then gain internal approval. Step 4 is all around submitting. So actually using the targets you developed, submitting everything in the portal, and then getting the target validated. Step 5 is around communication. So once your target is validated, you publicly communicate about your targets to inform stakeholders. And then subsequently, annually thereafter, you're going to have to annually disclose emissions and report progress against your target. So again, sped through those last 3 steps, but we'll be talking about those in more detail now. Okay, so deep dive into the develop target step. SBTi publishes standards and tools to help you specifically guide you through the target development process and ensure that you are meeting the latest criteria. As of today, the latest criteria is version 5.3.1 of the near-term criteria and version 2.5 of the near-term tool. But always, always check the latest resources in SBTi's website prior to developing and submitting your targets to ensure that you're actually using the latest criteria. So this may already be familiar to you, so I'll go through it relatively quickly, but based on the poll results, which thank you so much for participating, it does seem like we have quite a few folks who are in that first milestone bucket of exploring that first time target setting. So maybe this is helpful for that group as well. Um, there are 5 key aspects of a target. And I'm going to put an example target up here in following the target language used by SBTi, an example for company X, and walk through each of the 5 aspects here. The first is target type. So this includes, in this case, absolute targets, but it also can be intensity, supplier engagement targets, and then more potential options coming in V2. There's the scope of inclusion, which is indicating what scopes and categories the target is set for. In this case, it's scopes 1 and 2. There's the ambition level, which is what the percent reduction is, ideally aligned, to 1.5 degrees. And then there's the target year and the base year. So in this case, the target year is 2030, which is the year by which you need to meet your ambition. And then the base year is 2019, which is the year from which you're comparing emissions. So there's a lot of information jam-packed into an SBTi target, but all with purpose to clarify the target itself. Not only are you needing to develop that target that we just walked through in each of those 5 aspects as guided by the tool, but an not to be forgotten part and a very important step in the process of developing your targets is actually assessing potential decarbonization levers to meet those ambitious targets. So SBTi does currently ask for some details about decarbonization strategy within the portal currently. So depending on when you did your submission, this is also potentially a new requirement. In V2, there's expected to be a bit more criteria introduced, which we can get to in a moment. But when we say decarbonization levers, we mean how are you going to get from the baseline, which is your starting point, to the target, which is your endpoint? How really putting in some thought into how you're going to make progress towards your target. So some examples of common decarbonization levers. This is going to be generic, not necessarily one specific target, but think about this in the context of your organization and the target for that you've set. But some common examples include renewable energy procurement, electrification, low carbon policies, and supplier engagement, right? These are ideally, as an organization, something you can plan towards your specific target needs and the levers that are most feasible for your business. Those, I'll hint at the V2 proposed updates. I don't know, Kara, if we're going into this level of detail in the section following, so I'll just quickly say, since it's relevant to the decarbonization levers piece, the V2 standard currently proposes that you cover not just the target and high-level decarbonization levers, but actually actions on how they're going to be met. For the near term, there is also a requirement to do high-level road mapping beyond the near-term targets as you get towards net zero. It'll require assumptions and dependencies to be shared, and also description of how you plan to phase out the use and support of fossil fuels. And then maybe the most details, in my opinion, is the costing. So it'll also require an indicative approach to financing of your decarbonization initiative. So not just enough to say, these are the things we're going to do, but actually showing that you've thought through how this is going to impact the business from an operational and financial perspective. So this is one of, I would say, the most important parts, not just setting it, but also thinking about how you're going to get there. Once you've done that, then you go into the submission phase. I'll keep the submission and communication steps quick because not a ton has changed here other than submitting in the portal. But it's important that you do your submission step relatively soon after you do step 3, which is the developing. But remember that it is important to make sure that you're discussing and approving targets internally before submitting. You're going to do all of your submissions to the questionnaire in the validation portal. And it's worth noting that there are automated checks as you go that flag questions during your submission that maybe will be avoiding questions from coming up in the validation process, or some might even prevent you from moving forward. So it's really important that you go through the validation questionnaire really carefully. And related to the validation appointment, this is one of the new things. There's been a update to the validation schedule by SBTi in the last year or so that has shortened the process and made it more streamlined. And so once the validation process starts on your side, it'll be completed within 30 business days. In practice, we've seen this happen much quicker. So that it can happen much quicker, but it is guaranteed to happen within those 30 business days. Just be prepared to answer questions and adapt your submissions. Okay, the communication piece. Your approved target is going to be showing up in the dashboard about a month after validation. That's what this image screenshot is from. Typically, they're published in weekly batches on Thursdays. So if it doesn't appear immediately after once, that's just part of the regular schedule. But more importantly, the SBTi publishes communication guidance, which I've linked here and you'll get afterwards, that make sure that any communication you share is aligned with their expectations. And they do expect you to communicate them. SBTi indicates that companies have up to 6 months after approval to communicate the targets publicly, and any that go unannounced after that time actually have to be resubmitted for revalidation with the most recent version of the criteria. So it's important that you keep in mind communicating is an important step in the process. Okay, and last but not least, disclosure. Every single year after you set your target, you're going to be required to disclose things like progress against your target, so percent target completion for every single target, but also things like your emissions inventory, the updates on your renewable energy procurement, your supplier engagement strategy, any trends or changes that you see, the base year period from which the reported data is measured, and any adjustments or recalculations that you've made in the process since your target was set. As far as where to publish them, SBTi does not currently require any submission through their portal. It may change in the future, but when we are saying where you're publishing these is in your annual reports, sustainability reports, company website, like any public facing channel, and any of those are valid. Okay, last things last on the process before I hand it over to Kara is as part of the disclosure step, it's useful to make progress against your targets, right? You're going to have to report that percentage target completed. So you need to actually implement the decarbonization strategy that you created during target development stage. This may include increasing the quality of your data tracking, avoiding high emissions activities where possible, reducing emissions through those decarbonization levers that were identified where it's appropriate, working with existing partners to encourage decarbonization in your supply chain. So, think like supplier engagement here. Considering replacing high emitting assets, suppliers, processes with more sustainable options if you're unable to do a meaningful engagement. Integrate incentive mechanisms internally and externally to actually support your decarbonization journey. And then, of course, if you've committed to a net zero target, then neutralizing any of the residual emissions. But I've double tapped on the decarbonization piece because it is so important and it is going to become only more important with the updates proposed. All right, with that, I will hand it over to Kyra to talk through the proposed V2 updates.
Hi, thank you so much. So I imagine that folks have, again, if you have been following the SBTi on LinkedIn or you're subscribed to our newsletter, or maybe you've just heard rumblings, you probably know that we are in the midst of updating our corporate net zero standard. This is the SBTi's flagship standard, meaning that it sets the guidelines and criteria for both net zero targets and near-term targets within the SBTi system. We're going to quickly go through some of the elements of this standard, the timeline, the overview of the project, hoping to orient you a bit more to what's included in the standard and what you can expect over the course of 2026 and even into 2027 and 2028. Quickly, I need to read this quick disclaimer of that everything we talk about from here on out, no worries, is subject to change. Everything is still in proposal form. This standard, and I want to repeat this in all caps, in bold, however you need to visualize it, is not final yet. So everything I'm about to say is what was proposed in the latest draft of the standard, but nothing is absolutely final until this standard is released, which we are aiming for mid to late 2026. So certainly this year, but we do not know the exact timeline yet. Okay, wonderful. Let's get into it then. Great. So to start, why is the SBTi updating the standard right now? So partly it is due to our standard operating procedure. So this is the governance framework that dictates how the SBTi updates our standards. We are actually required by that framework to update our standards every 2 to 5 years. So one, we are due for an update. But on top of that, since the version 1 of the corporate net zero standard was released in 2021, we've learned a lot, right? The world has changed. We are in a vastly different context and environment than we were in 2021 when this standard was first released. So the SBTi recognizes that. We've had a lot of feedback from companies about what's working well in our current standard, what's not working so well, and what has room for improvement, right? So some of the goals with the updated standard. We really want to ensure that we remain aligned to science. That is, our core mission as science-based targets. While being more inclusive, we want to kind of broaden the tent of companies that can set science-based targets. We want to ensure we're focusing on action. So previously, the SBTi has been focused on verifying forward-looking ambition. This standard really marks an evolution for the SBTi of moving towards assessing action and performance and really digging into implementation and what's required to achieve targets. Next, we want to make it more adaptable to various business contexts. We know that depending on geography, position in the value chain, size, sector, a whole host of factors, one standard, global cross-sector standard, may not work, right, for various businesses. So we want to have a bit more tailoring. We want to get a bit more specific in how to apply some of these actions and criteria to your actual business context. Quickly, we'll say that we want to, of course, reflect updated climate science. We know that there have been, new underlying pathways released in the past couple of years. We've heard very much so that an update to Scope 3 would be appreciated. So we have been working on that for a long time, and we are expecting to dramatically evolve the way that Scope 3 target setting and implementation is approached in this standard. And third, we're moving towards a cyclical model of a continuous improvement. So essentially adding more clarity on how companies set targets, implement targets, assess performance, and then renew their targets for that next target cycle. Lastly, we want to improve the overall structure of the standard. We have heard many times that they are too long, they are too dense, we can't read it, we can't find what we need. So we're really hoping to streamline our standards, make them more practical, and hopefully implementable for any user that is setting science-based targets. So next we'll look at this is also a slide that I always am excited to present, but you can really see with these numbers that developing this updated standard has been a all hands on deck effort, okay? This is a stakeholder-driven process. We have very robust stakeholder engagement, and you can see here we've conducted 2 public consultations over the course of the project, resulting in close to 1,800 survey responses. We've also established expert working groups. So these were on 5 key topics related to the standard, each with approximately 20 experts across industry, academia, and civil society to advise the SBTi's technical staff on key technical topics and proposals within the standard. Not reflected on this slide, we also conducted pilot testing. So over 300 companies had a more detailed look, essentially trying on the standard to see how the proposals translated to their unique operations and value chains. Lastly, we're really excited to see that individuals from over 60 countries submitted feedback over the course of this project, which we think really reflects the global importance of credible corporate climate action. So one question I'm sure that is on everyone's mind, and I started to touch on earlier, but really is when will the finalized standard be released? And when do I have to start using it? So like I said, I cannot give a specific date at this time, but we are committed to publishing the final version of the standard in 2026. So of course, we hope to launch it as soon as we possibly can. We know that a lot of folks would like that clarity on what is a finalized proposal. Well, it would turn into a criteria as soon as possible. But we know it's critical to balance urgency with intention and accuracy. So again, we're hoping as soon as possible. We really hope it'll be mid-2026, but with the size of these projects, with the amount of stakeholders involved, we always want to leave room for additional time to deliberate, make decisions, et cetera. So when we get more information on when we might launch this standard, we will certainly broadcast that widely. Now let's take a look at some of the key elements proposed in the latest draft of the standard. So the latest draft was released in November of last year. We closed the public consultation and pilot testing in December 2025. So we've really been focusing in Q1 of this year on kind of integrating that feedback and evolving some of these proposals. But what I can tell you is what was in that latest draft. And I think it still gives a really good overview of the direction of travel and where we're headed with this final version. So first, we really want to ensure that companies have broad support and buy-in from senior leadership to pursue net zero targets. We also want to ensure that companies establish governance frameworks to oversee the implementation of targets. Critically, companies would also be required to develop and disclose transition plans. Natalia hit on that a bit earlier, but those transition plans really outline the high-level path to net zero and then more specific, detailed, granular actions and mitigation that will occur in that near-term target cycle. Those would be publicly disclosed within 12 months of validation. The SBTi is not anticipating that we will validate the transition plan. However, we may establish some minimum criteria, best practices, guidelines for what a good, credible transition plan will include. Moving to base year metrics and assurance, we propose that companies use the most recent year for which high quality emissions data is available as the base year for target setting under V2. We've also proposed that some companies would procure limited assurance over their greenhouse gas emissions inventory at the time of submission. And one reason we're moving towards this more recent base year is to simplify and standardize the overall journey for companies. It makes sense to start from that most recent year, draw the line to the net zero year, and use that to inform ambition. Next, we've proposed an evolved approach to ongoing emissions within the standard. So these are the emissions a company continues to emit on the path to net zero. First, with a voluntary recognition program for taking actions above and beyond a science-based target, and moving towards required actions for larger, more resourced companies in 2035. Lastly, we've proposed, like I said, kind of a new cyclical approach to setting, implementing, achieving, hopefully, and renewing targets to ensure that companies continue to stay focused on impactful near-term actions on the path to net zero. So quickly, let's take a look at some of the proposed changes for target setting under V2. In Scope 1, we've introduced two new options. The first are alignment targets. These are targets to increase the share of low carbon activities within a company's operations. Next is the asset decarbonization plan. So this is a plan which companies would replace high emitting assets. Over time, it may not be perfectly aligned to a target cycle. However, they would be either setting science-based milestones for their placement and or decommissioning, or within a defined carbon budget. So perhaps they're not on the exact same cycle as other linear options, but they are staying within an overall predefined carbon budget. In Scope 2, we've proposed that all companies would set a new low carbon electricity target. This is an alignment target to achieve 100% low carbon electricity by 2040. Companies would be required to meet new quality criteria for low carbon electricity procurement, either directly or through contractual mechanisms, such as matching within defined geographical boundaries and potentially moving towards hourly matching for the largest electricity consumers. All of these proposals, and especially within Scope 2, are still under deliberation. And we're also looking to ongoing developments and updates coming out of Greenhouse Gas Protocol around some of these more debatable proposals contained in both our standard and Greenhouse Gas Protocol. In Scope 3, we've suggested that companies set target over significant categories of emissions, which could be addressed through additional target setting and implementation options that have not previously been permitted in SBTi standards. So examples of this, again, would be an alignment target to align procurement or revenue to net zero benchmarks. And importantly, and not reflected necessarily here, but we've also proposed in some instances where physical traceability is limited or structural constraints exist, companies can use market-based instruments to address emission sources, provided they meet minimum integrity criteria. So quickly, based on all of that information, we know it's a lot, and that honestly just kind of is the tip of the iceberg with V2. I encourage you to take a look at our website if you want to learn more about detailed proposals in that draft. Companies are wondering, do I go ahead and set a target now with V1? Do I wait for V2? How does this impact me in the future? And the answer to that question really depends on an individual's company timeline, whether they are setting targets for the first time, renewing targets, recalculating targets, subject to a mandatory 5-year review. But in general, let's move to the timeline slide now. We can use this timeline to help at least start thinking about where those particular milestones might fit into the overall SBTi timeline. So again, anticipating that the finalized version 2 standard is released sometime this year, validations against that standard will likely not start until Q1 2027. For the duration of 2027, companies can choose to set targets against V1 or V2. So there will be a large period of overlap where companies can really deliberate. They can look through the standards, the criteria, see how they best fit their particular context and make an informed decision. From January 1st, 2028, new targets must be aligned to V2. We will essentially retire previous versions of the standard on that date. However, companies who have set targets against V1, it will not be the sudden kind of blanket move to V2. So companies setting near-term targets under V1, their targets are still valid until the end of the target timeframe or a mandatory, triggered, or voluntary update. So we will kind of honor that until the target timeframe, while excuse me, while eventually those companies, in years to come would eventually start to transition towards V2. But I just want to make it really clear that for new targets, that date is January 1st, 2028, but previously set targets run through the end of their target timeframe, or if they hit one of those milestones we've been talking about. Okay, that is all from me for now. So I hope we've got enough time for our questions, but I'll hand it back to you, Agendy.
Perfect. Okay, I'll keep the kind of last thing in a minute or so because I already know that we have more questions than we're going to be able to answer in the time that we have. So maybe this is a quick plug to say, if you've left a question anonymously and you'd like us to follow up with you after, consider putting it non-anonymously so that we can do so because we might not be able to get to all the questions. But okay, wrapping things up with some key takeaways. First is just review and update your science-based targets on a regular basis. This is already built into the process itself, including rebaselining and 5-year review. So it's going to be part of the process anyway, but is a good idea to make sure that you're always thinking about this if you've set a target. Second is to keep in mind that the V2 standard will be released later this year at a time to be determined, and will be required from January 1st, 2028. In the interim, if you're coming up on a target milestone, Kira alluded to this, it may make sense to perform an assessment of the target options under both standards to understand the possibilities that you have. And that's true for both, I guess, for each milestone, if it's applicable to you. Third is use the portal to your advantage. There are resources built into it that streamline efforts for you and for SBTi for all steps of the process. So please do use that. There's a lot of resources within their SBTi services page. And then, of course, would be silly to not say to please reach out for support, right? We have at Adendi 2 SBTi certified experts, including myself and Helena. So we'd be very happy to help answer the questions that you have in that regard. So with that, I know we're eager to start questions, so I kind of sped through that, but I'm going to thank all of you for your time and attention on the presentation portion. We're going to open it now to Q&A. And again, just noting we're probably not going to be able to get to answer all the questions. So this is another call to say if you've submitted an anonymous question that you really do want follow-up on, please submit it non-anonymously. Another note is we likely will not be able to answer highly company-specific questions, but please do ask them, like live. So please do ask them, and then again, we can follow up with you offline. Last plug before I go to our first question is that we are going to have a follow-up session once SBTi releases the V2 standard officially. A lot of this, of course, is proposed changes, and I think there's a lot of questions that may not be able to be answered until it's finalized. And so again, we're going to be sending out an invitation for that afterwards, but just keep that in mind as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll walk us through some of the questions. I am going to be prioritizing the ones that seem to be generalized enough that would be applicable to more than a couple of folks on the call. So please forgive my out of order selection here. I think something that maybe we just talked about that could be really useful to get your input on, Kyra, is how the SBTi is planning to support companies through the transition, if at all, kind of in reference to V1.3 and V2 interim time during 2027.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that, this obviously for a lot of companies, I mean, it marks a major shift, right? In the way that our standards are applied, the way that companies will be required to set targets, to disclose, there's a lot of changes. So we're planning a full suite of resources for launch. So we're hoping to have some resources available immediately upon the launch of the standard. For example, helping companies kind of walk through essentially a gap analysis of what's contained in V1, what's contained in V2, and hopefully having a simplified like cheat sheet to really see kind of the differences laid out side by side. We're also planning to hopefully publish some more detailed kind of transition guidance. So for those companies that do have targets under V1, how does this look? How does this impact kind of the investment decisions they're making? And we've also talked about, is there a possibility we develop some more streamlined pathways from going to V1 to V2? Beyond that, we're of course hoping to develop plenty of tools and FAQs and one pagers and decks and all the things that hopefully you would need to help yourself upskill. We'll also probably host some of those on our SBTi Academy site, which is our training platform. And I will be absolutely delivering many webinars, I'm sure. Of course, hopefully coming back to Agendi, but probably you'll see me in other places helping to explain really the core elements of this standard.
Perfect. So, the long story short is yes, there will be transition guidance provided, and will likely come along with when the standards are finalized. That's helpful to know. Um, I think there's two questions that feel quite similar that I'm going to pose to you now, Kira, about V2. Essentially, getting at that question that we had a slide on, like, should we wait to do V2 or should we just proceed now under current criteria? And then, for if you do use V1, when will you be expected to update them? So kind of, I feel like they're a bit similar and like, how do we move forward right now in this time of intermediary? And I think you covered it a little bit, but might make sense to restate it just in case that was unclear.
So what I've been recommending, I'm getting this question a lot. What I'm recommending, and something that I think is important to keep in mind for all companies. One is that you're allowed to update your targets at any time. I don't think that people know that you're allowed to come back and update your targets whenever you want. Most people don't, want to pursue this process multiple times. Most people want to kind of do a one and done in terms of securing internal buy-in and actually going through the development, submission, et cetera. But so what I'd say is for companies that have perhaps an external or an internal, there's a sense of urgency. Of course, you can go ahead and submit under version 1. And for some companies, they may just prefer to go ahead and get it done. They know exactly what they're working with. I think some of this is your individual threshold for ambiguity and uncertainty. So if you're, if the way that your team operates and your company operates is, you want to go ahead and move fast, then there's no issue in setting a target against version 1. Those will still be valid again till the end of their target timeframe, or perhaps there's a triggered or voluntary update. So in 3 years' time, if your company was to go through a major change that significantly impacted your targets and you were required to update your target, you may then need to transition to V2 if it's after that January 1st, 2028 timeline. But you still have, quite a runway where your targets are valid. And then for companies that maybe have less urgency, they're really just starting this process, or they've got some time before their next milestone where they have to update targets. You could, of course, give it a bit of time until that finalized standard is released. I'd also encourage you to engage with the draft materials. Again, they're not final, but they give you a really good sense of the direction of travel and what could be an option under version 2 that isn't an option under version 1 right now. So I hope that helps address it. I'd say it's highly dependent on the company context, where they're at in their target setting journey, and how they want to proceed.
Yeah, and maybe I'll quickly add on to this and just say that we're dealing with this all the time as well. So many questions about this, and I think honestly, some of the most useful next steps that we would recommend that you take is really just performing an assessment of the options that you have. Like you said, Kira, it's like some depending on where you are in your business and what emissions are significant or not, might actually have a big impact and what you feel is a higher priority or maybe even more feasible for your organization. So I'd say that's probably the first and most relevant step for all companies. Would appreciate it. Okay. Moving on to the next question because there's so many. There's actually a question about not V2, so that's why I'm picking this, to give a break from that a little bit. Um, the recent April 26 updates of the corporate tool. So they've said there has been significant changes to the resulting target trajectory. 5-year targets reduced from about 43% to 25%. Are you able to provide rationale for the update and how it impacts people who have not yet completed the validation of their targets but might have already submitted, is what I'm guessing is the question here.
Sure. Yeah. So recently, the SBTi, via SBTi Services, our subsidiary that validates targets, made an update to the formula in the target setting tool. So this formula controls the absolute contraction approach, or ACA, and it was based on a few elements, but there was fundamental misalignment between the ambition that this formula output and a net zero trajectory. So this was coming up for companies where they were on the path to net zero. They had already made significant progress in their previous target cycle. They were still kind of required to meet very high ambition levels for 2030 that were actually higher than their trajectory to net zero. So we updated this formula to more accurately reflect the ambition level that we're also moving towards with version 2, which is really starting from that most recent year and drawing that line out to the net zero year. So it results in the linear annual rate of reduction is still the same. It's very similar. The way it is being applied is now more standardized across companies. So regardless of when you're entering the SBTi system, you will be beholden to kind of the same level of decarbonization as another company. I imagine that we will have a bit more communication around this piece forthcoming, as I think it is perhaps created a bit more confusion than maybe we thought it would. So please be on the lookout for that. And what I can say, I believe this update went into effect on April 14th. It is unclear to me right now how companies that were submitting right before that cutoff date would be treated, but I imagine SBTi Services retains the right to treat a lot of items on a case-by-case basis. So that's important to know. And then, yeah, starting April 14th, it seems like that new formula is applied uniformly to new submissions.
Okay, thank you. I know we only have 1 minute left, but I'm wondering whether we can squeeze out one more speedy question because I know we were a little bit late to start. So I'll maybe this is too big for now, but I think there's a couple of questions around market-based mechanisms and how they play into SBTi. So one's just around RECs and the other's around sustainable aviation fuel, or I'm guessing just biofuels and probably certificates in general, and how that affects scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So would you be able to comment on how market-based mechanisms are expected to be applied in V2?
Yes and no, right? I can tell you what was in the draft, but not, maybe what's going to make it into the final standard, because even I don't know exactly where some of those things will land. But I can say that we, in the draft versions of version 2, we introduced the use of market-based mechanisms and environmental attribute certificates in various scenarios where there potentially is limited physical traceability or structural constraints exist. So primarily these were focused on scope 3, obviously scope 2, that's kind of a well-established practice there. We actually currently, I know there was some evolution in terms of SAF. I know that was kind of a big interest for folks, particularly looking at, business travel and logistics and transportation, air freight transport. So it maybe, I have a hard time imagining that we won't see some of those things make it to the final standard. I think it's just pretty well established that those are necessary to some degree right now in the interim. where we haven't built up the systems yet to deliver emission reductions at the source, or there hasn't been that kind of physical connection, right? So I have a hard time imagining that we would like quote
Mhm.
unquote walk back on any of those items, because we do know that they're important and they do play a critical interim role, while we're still hoping that we have wide systems level change.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that it's not finalized yet, right? So there's only so much we can say, but I'm sure it's good to hear that that's still something that's at least being taken into consideration for the V2 standard. So thank you so, so much for your time. Everyone on the call who's joined us today, Kyra, for your time on answering all these really difficult questions. For anyone who we didn't get to answer your questions, but you did leave your name, we'll be following up individually to hopefully give you a little bit more satisfactory answers. And we'll be inviting everybody to the number 2 webinar once the V2 standard has come out officially, and then hopefully we'll be able to answer more of your questions in a substantial way. So um, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks, all.
Thank you all so much. Take care.